In 1991, a man named Rolf Dobelli decided to run an experiment on himself. He simply stopped. No news apps, no newspapers, no headlines, no push notifications, nothing. He expected to feel uninformed, cut off, maybe even a little afraid of missing something important. Instead, within a few months, something unexpected happened. He felt calmer than he had in years. He read more books than he had in the previous decade combined. And when major events did eventually reach him, secondhand, through conversations and long-form writing, he understood them more deeply than he ever had while checking headlines 5 times a day. Here's the question worth sitting with before we go any further. If a Swiss entrepreneur can go completely dark on daily news and come out the other side more informed, not less, what exactly is all that daily scrolling actually giving you? That's the entire argument of Dobelli's book, Stop Reading the News, and it's a much more radical claim than it first sounds. Stay with me. By the end of this, you'll never look at a headline the same way again. A simple truth to start. Here's the plain truth Dobelli opens with, and it cuts against nearly everything we've been told about being an informed, engaged citizen. News, in the modern sense, tiny fragmented updates delivered continuously throughout the day, does not make you smarter. It makes you anxious, distracted, and paradoxically, less informed about the things that actually matter. The economist and Nobel laureate Herbert Simon saw this coming decades before smartphones existed. He wrote that a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it. Dobelli's entire book is, in a sense, a modern field guide to exactly that problem, applied specifically to the thing most of us consume more compulsively than almost anything else: the news. Why news feels important but rarely is asterisk. Dobelli draws a sharp distinction that turns out to be the foundation for everything else in the book: the difference between news and knowledge. News is a headline about a factory fire in a city you'll never visit. Knowledge is understanding how global supply chains actually work, why they're fragile, and what that means for the products on your own shelves. News expires within a day. Knowledge compounds for years. The trouble, Dobelli argues, is that news items masquerade as knowledge. They arrive dressed in the same authoritative tone, the same serious typeface, the same sense of urgency, so our brains file them in the same mental category as things genuinely worth knowing. But a fragment about a celebrity scandal, an isolated crime story from a city you've never been to, a minor political gaffe, these rarely change any decision you'll ever actually make. They simply occupy space that could have gone toward something that would. Henry David Thoreau, writing more than a century before the 24-hour news cycle existed, observed that he had never read any memorable news in a newspaper, and that if you'd read of one man being robbed or one ship being wrecked, you effectively never needed to read of another, because the underlying pattern repeats endlessly while the specific details are almost never worth retaining. Dobelli's argument updates that observation for an era where the volume of interchangeable, forgettable fragments has multiplied 1,000-fold. The biological trap: why news is built to be addictive. One of the more unsettling sections of the book walks through exactly why news consumption feels so hard to stop, and the answer isn't a lack of willpower. It's biology, deliberately exploited. Every new headline, every notification, every fresh piece of information triggers a small release of dopamine, the same neurochemical reward system involved in nearly every other compulsive behavior. Crucially, it's not the content of the news that produces this hit, it's the novelty itself. Your brain doesn't care whether the update is actually meaningful. It only cares that it's new. That's why refreshing a feed feels satisfying even when, rationally, you know the actual content rarely changes anything about your day. Dobelli compares this directly to slot machine design, an industry that has spent decades perfecting the science of unpredictable reward. the same mechanism casinos use to keep players pulling a lever long after any rational person would have stopped. News apps, whether intentionally or not, run on an almost identical structure. Intermittent, unpredictable rewards, delivered in an endless scroll specifically engineered to never give you a natural stopping point. You don't check the news because you've made a reasoned decision that today's update is worth your time. You check it because the format has trained your brain to expect the next dopamine hit just one more scroll away. What news actually costs you? It's tempting to think of news consumption as essentially harmless, a few minutes here and there, surely not worth agonizing over. Dobelli pushes back hard against that framing, and his case rests on three specific costs that compound far more than most people assume. The first is time. A few minutes scattered throughout the day sounds trivial, but added up across a year, regular news consumption easily consumes hundreds of hours, time that could have gone toward books, deep work, or actual relationships, all of which produce lasting value in a way that yesterday's headline simply doesn't. The second is attention, and this cost is subtler but arguably more damaging. Deep thinking, the kind required to solve real problems or produce meaningful work, requires sustained, uninterrupted focus. Dobelli argues that habitual news consumption trains the brain into a state of chronic, shallow skimming, an attention span optimized for scanning fragments rather than following a complex idea through to its conclusion. The cost isn't just the minutes spent reading, it's the residual difficulty concentrating on anything else afterward. The third cost is emotional, and it's the one most people actually notice, even if they don't connect it to its source. News is disproportionately negative, because negative events are more attention-grabbing than positive ones, and outlets compete relentlessly for exactly that attention. The result, Dobelli argues, is a chronic, low-grade anxiety about a world that, by most long-term measures, is actually improving in most of the ways that matter: poverty, violence, disease, but doesn't feel that way to someone marinating in a daily stream of the worst thing that happened anywhere on the planet in the last 24 hours. The availability trap: why vivid stories distort your judgment asterisk. Dobelli, whose earlier work focused extensively on cognitive biases, applies one of the most well-documented biases in psychology directly to news consumption: the availability heuristic. Our tendency to judge how common or important something is based on how easily examples come to mind, rather than on actual statistics. News is, almost by definition, a machine for generating vivid, memorable examples of rare events. A plane crash makes headlines precisely because it's rare. A car crash, which kills vastly more people every single day, doesn't because it's common enough to no longer be news. The result is a systematic distortion. Heavy news consumers tend to overestimate the likelihood of dramatic, rare dangers, terrorism, plane crashes, exotic diseases, while underestimating the much larger, much more mundane risks that never make a headline because they're too ordinary to be interesting. The physicist and essayist Nassim Nicholas Taleb, whose work Dobelli draws on directly, has argued that the rarer and more sensational an event, the more coverage it receives, and the less relevant it actually is to any single person's real decisions or real risks. Reading about it repeatedly doesn't make you safer or more prepared. It simply distorts your internal map of what the world's actual dangers look like. A full example: 24 hours with and without the news asterisk. Let's put the theory into a single, concrete comparison, the way Dobelli's book likes to do throughout. Picture two versions of the same person on the same ordinary Tuesday. Version 1 checks the news first thing in the morning, 3 coffee breaks, lunch, and again before bed, absorbing perhaps 40 small fragments over the course of the day. A political dispute in a country they'll never visit, a celebrity controversy, an isolated violent crime 2,000 miles away, a stock market fluctuation that will have entirely reversed by Thursday. By evening, this version of the person feels vaguely informed, vaguely anxious, and can recall almost none of the 40 fragments in any real detail a week later. Version 2 doesn't check the news at all. Instead, that same scattered time, roughly 90 minutes across the day, goes into 40 pages of a book on a subject they actually care about, a longer conversation with a colleague about something genuinely relevant to their work, and at week's end, one long-form article or essay about a significant event, read in full, with context, written days or weeks after the fact once the actual analysis had caught up with the initial fragments. A week later, version 2 remembers almost everything they engaged with, understands the one significant event of the week far more deeply than version 1 ever did from 40 passing headlines, and finished a book besides. Dobelli's argument is that this isn't a hypothetical thought experiment. It's simply what happens, reliably, when the same scattered attention gets redirected from fragments toward depth. What Dobelli actually recommends. To his credit, Dobelli doesn't just diagnose the problem and leave readers stranded. His prescription is specific and considerably more radical than just check your phone less. Cut news out entirely. He argues, not moderate it, not curate it more carefully, cut it out completely. The same way you might quit a substance rather than try to manage a controlled, moderate relationship with it. His reasoning is that news, unlike most things worth moderating, offers so little actual value per unit of time that the effort of trying to curate a healthy amount simply isn't worth it. There's no meaningful signal buried in the noise that justifies wadding through the noise to find it. In its place, Dobelli recommends long-form journalism and books, specifically material written with enough distance from an event that the initial fog of incomplete, contradictory information has had time to clear. He argues that if something is genuinely important enough to affect your life or decisions, it will reach you anyway, through conversation, through the people around you, through the kind of deep, delayed reporting that actually explains what happened rather than simply announcing that it did. The illusion of understanding asterisk. One of the more counterintuitive claims in the book concerns something Dobelli calls the illusion of understanding. The false confidence news consumption produces even as it fails to deliver actual comprehension. Because headlines and short updates are written to sound authoritative and complete, readers walk away feeling like they grasp a situation, a war, an economic downturn, a political crisis, when in reality they've absorbed a handful of disconnected facts stripped of the context that would let them actually reason about the situation. Dobelli illustrates this with a simple thought experiment. Ask someone who reads the news daily to explain, in detail, the underlying causes of a conflict they've been reading headlines about for months. Most people, he observes, can recite a few names, a rough timeline of recent events, and a couple of dramatic incidents, but struggle badly the moment they're asked to explain the actual structural forces at play, the historical grievances, the economic incentives, the competing interests of the parties involved. That gap between felt understanding and actual understanding is, in Dobelli's view, one of news consumption's most dangerous side effects, because a false sense of comprehension is often worse than an honest sense of ignorance. The honestly ignorant person knows to seek out a real explanation. The falsely informed person doesn't feel the need to. The philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell wrote that the trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure while the intelligent are full of doubt. And while he wasn't writing about news consumption specifically, Dobelli's argument suggests the modern news cycle actively manufactures exactly that dynamic. A steady stream of confident-sounding fragments that inflate certainty while quietly stripping away the deeper context that real understanding actually requires. Why editors aren't the villain here? It would be easy to read Dobelli's argument as an attack on journalists or news organizations, painting them as villains deliberately manipulating readers for profit. Dobelli is careful to push back against that framing, and it's worth spending a moment on why, because the distinction matters for what you actually do with this information. Most journalists, he argues, are working conscientiously within a system whose incentive structure was never designed around reader well-being in the first place. Advertising-driven media has always rewarded engagement and attention over depth and accuracy, long before smartphones existed, but the shift to instantaneous digital publishing simply intensified an incentive that was already there. Individual editors making individual headline decisions are, for the most part, responding rationally to a competitive environment that rewards speed and emotional pull over patient, contextualized explanation. Blaming any single outlet or journalist misses the more important point. The format itself, not any particular actor's malice, is what produces the costs Dobelli is describing. This distinction matters practically because it changes where Dobelli directs his solution. He isn't arguing for reforming journalism, waiting for editors to behave differently, or petitioning platforms to change their algorithms. His solution is entirely personal and immediate. Since the system's incentives aren't going to realign in your favor, the only lever actually available to you is your own consumption. And that lever, unlike systemic reform, you can pull today. The difference between curiosity and compulsion. A question Dobelli anticipates from skeptical readers is whether cutting out news entirely means abandoning genuine intellectual curiosity about the world, becoming insular, disengaged, indifferent to what's happening beyond your own life. His answer draws a sharp line between two things that feel similar but function very differently: curiosity and compulsion. Genuine curiosity, in Dobelli's framing, is directed, patient, and self-initiated. It looks like picking up a book about a region you're interested in, reading a long profile of a person or institution shaping current events, following a subject in depth over months because you've decided it matters to you. Compulsion looks different. It's reactive rather than chosen, driven by notification rather than genuine interest, and satisfied by novelty rather than depth. You can tell the difference, Dobelli suggests, by asking a simple question after any period of consumption. Did I choose this deliberately because I wanted to understand something better, or did I simply respond to a ping, a red notification badge, an idle moment that needed filling? Reframed this way, quitting news isn't quitting curiosity about the world at all. It's redirecting the same underlying appetite for understanding away from a format engineered to exploit it, and toward formats that actually reward patience with genuine depth. A 30-day experiment you can actually run. If the argument so far sounds persuasive but abstract, Dobelli offers a concrete way to test it yourself rather than simply taking his word for it. A 30-day period of complete news abstinence, treated as an experiment rather than a permanent lifestyle change, with the explicit goal of observing what actually happens to your own attention, mood, and knowledge, rather than guessing in advance. The protocol is straightforward. Remove news apps from your phone entirely, not just muted, actually deleted. Unsubscribe from news alerts and push notifications. If you pass a newspaper or a television playing news in public, that's fine. You're not required to physically avoid the world just to stop actively seeking updates out. For 30 days, redirect that reclaimed time and attention toward one or two books on subjects you've been meaning to explore, and toward longer, deliberately chosen pieces of writing about anything you're still curious about. Dobelli's prediction, based on his own experience and the reports of readers who have tried it, is specific. The first 3 or 4 days typically feel uncomfortable, even anxious, a kind of withdrawal that mirrors quitting any habitual behavior. By the second week, most people report the anxiety fading and a noticeable improvement in their ability to concentrate on longer material. By day 30, the majority of participants report that the handful of genuinely significant events from that month reached them anyway, through friends, colleagues, or conversation, usually with more accurate context than a same-day headline would have provided, while the hundreds of forgettable fragments they would have consumed instead simply never came up at all. because they were never actually important enough to matter to anyone's daily conversation in the first place. The value of treating this as an experiment rather than a moral commitment, Dobelli notes, is that it sidesteps the all-or-nothing anxiety many people feel about permanently swearing off something. You're not promising to never read news again. You're simply gathering 30 days of your own personal data about what you actually lose and what you actually gain when you stop. Now let's be honest. Every book like this deserves an honest accounting in return, and here it is. Dobelli's own position, as an independent, financially secure writer with significant control over his own schedule, is not the position most people are actually in. A working journalist, a public health official, a small business owner tracking regulatory changes, a parent monitoring a specific unfolding local emergency, all have professional or practical reasons to track certain categories of news that Dobelli's blanket, cut it all out advice doesn't fully account for. The book's prescription works cleanly for someone whose daily decisions genuinely don't hinge on breaking developments. It works considerably less cleanly for someone whose job or safety actually does. There's a second tension worth nomming. Dobelli argues persuasively that most individual news fragments don't matter, but the aggregate pattern across many fragments sometimes does. Early, scattered signals of a systemic problem, a slowly building public health issue, a shift in a regulatory environment that only becomes visible in hindsight by connecting dots that, individually, looked like forgettable noise at the time. A blanket avoidance strategy risks missing exactly the kind of early pattern recognition that occasionally does matter, even if any single fragment, viewed in isolation, genuinely didn't. A third point, and Dobelli would likely concede this himself, there's a civic dimension to news consumption that the book's individual-focused framing somewhat sidesteps. Democratic participation, voting, holding local officials accountable, does benefit from some baseline awareness of current events, even if the optimal amount is far lower than most people's actual daily consumption. The book's argument is strongest as a corrective to excessive, compulsive consumption. It's on shakier ground if taken as an argument for zero civic awareness whatsoever. Even with those caveats, the book's core diagnosis holds up remarkably well against both personal experience and the psychological research it draws on. The specific format of modern news, fragmented, continuous, engineered for engagement rather than understanding, produces measurable anxiety and distraction while delivering strikingly little of what we'd actually call knowledge. That mismatch between cost and value is real, whatever the right individual dosage turns out to be. The takeaway, what to actually carry with you. So let's strip away the argument's edges and see what's left, in plain terms. First, separate news from knowledge in your own mind. A headline that will be irrelevant in a week is not the same category of information as a book or a long-form piece that changes how you actually understand something. Treat them differently because your brain, left unchecked, will happily treat them the same. Second, notice the mechanism, not just the content. If checking a feed feels compulsive rather than deliberate, that's not a personal failing. It's the intended design of a system built around unpredictable, novelty-driven reward. Recognizing the mechanism makes it considerably easier to step outside it. Third, if something is genuinely important, it will find you anyway, through the people around you, through the deeper reporting that follows once the facts have actually settled. You are not, in practice, at risk of missing something that truly matters simply by refusing to check a feed every 20 minutes. Fourth, and this is the one worth sitting with, the time and attention that habitual news consumption quietly consumes is not neutral. It's time that could have gone toward a book, a real conversation, a piece of deep work, and unlike yesterday's headline, those things actually compound. Rolf Dobelli didn't become less informed the day he stopped reading the news. He became more selective about what deserved his attention in the first place. That distinction, between informed and merely inundated, turns out to be the whole argument. And it's one you get to test for yourself the very next time your thumb reaches for that familiar app out of habit rather than genuine need.